Before we dive into the political drama, palace conspiracies, and enough backstabbing to make a soap opera blush, let's set the stage. This is the story of Qin Shi Huang, but back when he was just little Ying Zheng, a baby with no idea he'd one day have an entire wall built across a continent. Born into the chaos of the Warring States period, Zheng's cradle might as well have been a political chessboard. His father was King Xiang of Qin, his mother, the cunning Lady Zhao Qi, and the neighbors? Well, they were 7 rival states all trying to take each other's lunch money permanently. This opening isn't just about dates and names. It's about inviting you on a journey through the rise of China's first emperor, starting from his very first cry. So buckle up, comment where you're watching from, and let's see how a boy born into one of the most dangerous times in history became the man who would unify it all. Before we dive into baby Ying Zheng's first steps, let's zoom out and check the chaos he was born into, the Warring States period. Imagine 7 big kingdoms on one map, all acting like cranky roommates who can't agree on who left dishes in the sink, except their arguments involve armies, siege weapons, and a lot of screaming generals. The borders shifted faster than a card trick, alliances were made and broken over dinner, and spies, oh, they were as common as street vendors. Each kingdom had its own way of doing things. Currency, laws, even weights and measures. Meaning crossing the border could be as confusing as traveling to a parallel universe. Into this mess, the state of Qin stood out. Ambitious, disciplined, and itching for expansion. This was the board on which little Ying Zheng's life would be played. A game of survival, power, and very sharp swords. Now let's zoom in on the baby in question. Ying Zheng's origin story is already the stuff of palace gossip. His father, King Zhuangshang of Qin, was technically the ruler. But here's the twist, Ying Zheng wasn't even born in Qin territory. Nope, he made his debut in Zhao, one of Qin's fiercest rivals. That's like the future CEO of a tech giant being born in the office of their biggest competitor. His mother, Lady Zhao Ji, was a beauty whose political connections could fill a drama series. And hovering in the background was Lu Buwei, a merchant-turned-mastermind whose influence was, let's say, a little too close for comfort. Historians still debate the exact details of this trio's tangled relationships, but one thing's for sure. Ying Zheng's crib was placed in the middle of a political chessboard, and every piece was already in motion. Destiny wasn't just knocking on his door, it was barging in, wearing armor. Being born in an enemy state is already awkward, but growing up there as a political hostage, that's next-level awkward. Little Ying Zheng's childhood in Zhao was basically one long game of don't trust anyone. Every smile from a courtier could hide a dagger, and every meal might be seasoned with extra flavor. The court of Zhao didn't exactly treat him like a royal guest, more like a valuable bargaining chip wrapped in silk. Outside the palace, the air smelled of war. Soldiers marching, blacksmiths hammering weapons, and the distant rumble of siege engines. Inside, whispers of political intrigue floated through the corridors like incense smoke. For young Ying Zheng, this was less a childhood and more an early crash course in survival, diplomacy, and the fine art of keeping your head attached to your neck. By the time he could walk, he already knew how to read a room and how to spot a trap before dessert. If little Ying Zheng's life in Zhao was a lesson in survival, then his relationship with his mother and Lu Buwei was the masterclass in politics. Lady Zhao Ji was no ordinary mother. She was a stunning beauty with a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for self-preservation. Beside her was Lu Buwei, the ultimate power broker, part merchant, part politician, part rumor magnet. He had a knack for making friends in high places and making enemies disappear. To young Ying Zheng, this unusual duo were both protectors and puppet masters, shielding him from immediate danger while subtly shaping his worldview. Dinner table conversations weren't about fairy tales. They were about alliances, bribes, and which noble was plotting against whom this week. Whether he knew it or not, Ying Zheng was already being trained to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, and learning that in this world, affection and strategy often wore the same face. Growing up in Zhao wasn't all doom and gloom for young Ying Zheng. It was also his training ground for becoming a master strategist. Forget toy soldiers. He had real ones marching outside his window. Instead of bedtime stories, he got cautionary tales about generals who trusted the wrong ally and ended up headless. Yingzheng learned to read people the way others read bamboo scrolls, spotting lies in polite smiles, weighing every word like gold dust. He also picked up the fine art of observation, from the way a minister's hands fidgeted when lying, to the subtle smirk of someone who thought they'd outsmarted him. These skills weren't taught in any classroom. They were sharpened daily in the palace corridors where gossip moved faster than messengers. By the time most kids his age were figuring out how to catch fish, Yingzheng was already catching lies and plotting his next move. Fate didn't exactly send a polite invitation. It barged in with bad news. King Zhuangsheng of Qin, Yingzheng's father, had died. And just like that, at the tender age of 13, our young political prodigy was now king of Qin. Sounds grand, right? Except the real power sat comfortably in the hands of Lu Buwei, who quickly stepped in as regent, smiling like a cat that had found a whole warehouse of fish. For Yingzheng, this was a strange promotion. He got the crown, but not the keys to the kingdom. Every decision still had to go through the man who had been pulling strings since before he could walk. Yet behind the formal bows and obedient nods, the new king was quietly taking notes, watching, learning, and maybe, just maybe, sharpening his own strings to pull in the future. After all, even a teenager with a crown knows that power is a game best played patiently. The crown may have been on Yingzheng's head, but the steering wheel of the kingdom was firmly in Lu Buwei's hands. As regent, Lu ran the court like a seasoned chess master, moving ministers like pawns and blocking any piece that looked too ambitious. Young Yingzheng played the role of the dutiful monarch, nodding at decrees, attending ceremonies, and letting Lu take the spotlight. But behind that calm teenage face was a brain working overtime. He listened to court debates as if they were war drums, noting who spoke too much, who smiled too often, and who was suspiciously quiet. Every slip of the tongue, every glance exchanged, was another puzzle piece in his growing picture of how power really worked. If Lu thought he was raising a pliable boy king, he might have been in for a surprise, because Yingzheng was quietly studying the game with the patience of someone who planned to win it. At some point, Yingzheng decided that wearing the crown without holding the reins was like owning a chariot without the horses. Impressive to look at, useless to drive. Slowly but surely, he began taking small bites out of Lu Buwei's authority. A dispute over land? Yingzheng would personally summon both parties and make the ruling himself. A military report came in? He'd read it before Lu even touched it. Ministers started to realize that the quiet boy king was now a sharp young ruler who preferred to ask uncomfortable questions, the kind that made people sweat under their fancy hats. He didn't make a dramatic power grab. Instead, he used patience and precision, like a craftsman carving a statue, chip by chip. By the time Lu noticed, Yingzheng had already tightened his grip on key decisions. It was the beginning of a shift in power. And the teenager's eyes now gleamed with the confidence of someone who was finally steering his own empire. So here we are. The boy who was born in enemy territory, raised among daggers and whispers, now sitting on the throne of Qin with a mind sharper than any sword in the royal armory. The path ahead? Nothing less than uniting a fractured land where every ruler thinks they're the main character. It's like trying to host a family dinner where all 7 uncles have armies and grudges. But Yingzheng isn't the same wide-eyed hostage anymore. He's a young king who's learned that patience is as deadly as steel, and that smiling can be more dangerous than shouting. As we leave his childhood behind, the question isn't whether he can survive. He's already mastered that. The real question is, can he turn survival into domination? And just how far will he go to make sure his crown doesn't slip? Spoiler alert, pretty far. For years, Lu Buwei had been the ultimate backstage director of Qin's political drama, writing the script, casting the ministers, and making sure the young king played his part. But now Yingzheng was done being a supporting actor. The first act of his power play? Removing Lu from the stage entirely. Officially, it was all very polite. Titles shuffled, duties reassigned, and Lu retired with honors. Unofficially, it was like being told you're promoted to a position on a faraway farm. Forever. Lu, sensing the storm, stepped back quietly, perhaps hoping the history books would still be kind. For the court, it was a shock. The boy they thought was still learning the ropes had just cut one of the thickest ropes in the kingdom. And for Ying Zheng, it was the first clean slice in carving out his rule. Proof that he wasn't afraid to pull the plug on even his oldest political mentors. Just when the court thought the drama was over with Lu Buwei's exit, Ying Zheng turned his attention to a problem much closer to home. Literally, his mother, Lady Zhaoji, was enjoying the company of a certain Lao Ai, a man whose charm was matched only by his ambition. Unfortunately, that ambition allegedly included plans to replace the king himself. For Ying Zheng, this wasn't just an embarrassing family scandal. It was a security breach in silk robes. When the plot unraveled, it did so spectacularly. Lao Ai's secret forces were crushed, and his fate sealed in a way that made it very clear. The palace was no place for amateur power grabs. Lady Zhaoji was quietly moved away from politics, ensuring no further romantic subplots would distract from the main story. With this, Ying Zheng sent a sharp message to friend and foe alike. No one, not even family, could toy with the throne. After cleaning up palace scandals, Ying Zheng turned to the messy business of government itself. The Qin bureaucracy was like an ancient game of Go, strategic, but cluttered with too many lazy stones. It was time to replace ornamental pieces with ones that could actually win battles. Enter Li Si, a sharp-minded legalist with a talent for paperwork so lethal it could topple kingdoms. While others still measured success by the size of their hats, Li Si was busy redrawing the chessboard, promoting merit over family name. Old aristocrats grumbled as they were quietly shuffled out, replaced by capable administrators who actually knew how to read more than wine labels. For Ying Zheng, this wasn't just an HR makeover. It was the foundation for a machine that could run the country efficiently, crush corruption, and make sure every tax grain and military order landed exactly where it was supposed to. The message was clear. Loyalty and competence now had a seat at the table. Idleness and nepotism could eat outside. With the government now humming like a well-oiled chariot, Ying Zheng turned his attention to the sharp end of power. The military. The Qin army was already formidable, but in Ying Zheng's eyes, formidable was just a polite way of saying, could be scarier. Blacksmiths were ordered to upgrade swords with stronger steel, spears with longer reach, and crossbows with trigger mechanisms so smooth they could make an enemy rethink their life choices. Armor got an upgrade too, lighter yet tougher, so soldiers could charge faster without looking like overstuffed dumplings. But weaponry was just half the battle. Tactics needed a glow-up. Generals were drilled in new formations, and war drums thundered across training fields as thousands of troops practiced maneuvers with military precision. It was less of a ragtag medieval army now, and more like a synchronized performance of death by discipline. For Ying Zheng, every polished blade and every perfectly timed charge wasn't just preparation, it was a promise to the other states. The Qin weren't here to play games. They were here to win the board. If Qin's army was the sword, then the law was the iron grip holding it steady, and Ying Zheng intended that grip to be unshakable. Enter legalism, a philosophy that basically said, trust is nice, but fear works better. Laws were written with the precision of a master calligrapher and the cruelty of a bad-tempered executioner. No bribe was big enough, no noble's title grand enough to save anyone from punishment. Small crimes meant hard labor. Big crimes meant losing more than just face. Inspectors roamed the streets like hawks, and bureaucrats found that slacking off now came with life-ruining consequences. Even the nobility began double-checking their every move, because in Qin, nobody was above the law, not even the guy who wrote it. It wasn't about being cruel for cruelty's sake. Ying Zheng saw it as tightening the bolts on the machinery of state so nothing rattled loose. And while the people might have grumbled, they also slept better at night knowing the rules were clear, painfully clear. While soldiers drilled and laws tightened, Ying Zheng knew an empire can't run on empty stomachs or empty coffers. So he rolled out an economic game plan with all the subtlety of a chess master and the efficiency of a tax collector on caffeine. Farmers became the rock stars of Qin, with land grants and irrigation projects that made fields bloom like never before. Grain storage facilities popped up across the kingdom, ensuring that even a bad harvest didn't mean empty bowls. At the same time, merchants found themselves operating under watchful eyes. Trade was encouraged, but so was regulation. Taxes were collected with precision, trade routes were secured, and smuggling was treated like a personal insult to the throne. In Yingzheng's view, wealth wasn't just about gold. It was about a steady, reliable flow of resources, feeding both the people and the war machine. Because you can't conquer the world if your soldiers are too hungry to lift a sword. Yingzheng knew that swinging a sword at every neighbor wasn't always the smartest move. Sometimes the sharpest weapon was a well-timed smile. Qin's diplomacy became a masterclass in patience and calculated charm. Messengers were sent with polite words and expensive gifts, buying peace treaties the way some people buy time on an overdue bill. Rivals were lulled into a false sense of security, believing that Qin was simply too busy with farming or lawmaking to be thinking about conquest. Behind the scenes, of course, Yingzheng was quietly gathering intelligence, mapping out enemy weaknesses, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In some cases, marriages were arranged between noble families, weaving alliances like an intricate spiderweb. These temporary truces weren't a sign of softness. They were pauses in the game, the kind a skilled player takes just before flipping the board. And when the time was right, those smiling envoys would be replaced with marching armies. Rebellions inside Qin were like weeds in a well-kept garden, annoying, persistent, and popping up just when you thought you'd gotten rid of them. Yingzheng didn't just pull the weeds, he yanked them out by the roots and salted the soil. When local lords got too ambitious or peasants decided to test the limits of the law, Qin's response was swift and decisive. Armies marched in with the efficiency of a well-oiled crossbow, crushing uprisings before they could spread. Public trials served as both justice and a cautionary tale, with the guilty paraded for all to see. At the same time, Zheng cleverly balanced fear with incentives. Loyal officials were rewarded handsomely, and communities that stayed in line enjoyed peace and stability. This wasn't just about flexing military muscle. It was about sending a clear message. Order in Qin was not optional. Every quelled rebellion tightened Zheng's grip on power, paving the way for his bigger dream: one empire under one ruler, with no room for dissent. With rebellions crushed and the home front secured, Yingzheng turned his gaze outward. You can't conquer the world on an empty stomach, so the Qin began stockpiling grain like a squirrel before winter. Except squirrels don't also forge thousands of bronze swords. Vast storehouses filled with millet, wheat, and rice were guarded as tightly as the royal treasury. Meanwhile, soldiers trained relentlessly, perfecting drills until they could march in perfect unison without tripping over their own feet. Blacksmiths worked day and night, hammering out new weapons while armorers ensured every soldier gleamed like a walking wall of bronze. War horses were bred and conditioned, ready to charge at a moment's notice. Even the supply lines were mapped out with military precision, ensuring that when the time came, Qin's armies would move like a single unstoppable beast. To the neighbors, Qin's peaceful preparations looked suspiciously like sharpening a very large knife while smiling politely. By now, Yingzheng had transformed Qin from a regional power into a fortress with ambition. Political rivals eliminated. The court, packed with loyal talent like Li Si. The army, a steel-edged machine fed by overflowing granaries. Diplomats had bought precious time with smooth words, while the law kept everyone in line, sometimes with a stick. Inside and out, Qin stood rock solid, like a coiled dragon ready to spring. Zheng, no longer just the king of Qin, now saw himself as the future ruler of all under heaven. His generals sharpened swords, his ministers sharpened policies, and the people sharpened, well, their farming tools, because someone still had to grow all that grain. Across the map, other kingdoms sensed a shift in the wind, the kind that precedes a storm. The stage was set, the actors prepared, and the curtain was about to rise on the grand unification war. The dragon was awake, and it was hungry. Yingzheng wasn't about to rush headlong into battle like some overexcited rookie warlord. No, he had a plan worthy of a chess grandmaster. Except the chessboard was China, and the pieces were actual armies. His strategy? Divide and conquer. Why take on all 6 kingdoms at once when you can politely dismantle them one by one? First, isolate a target, cut off its alliances, and convince its neighbors that helping would be more trouble than it's worth. Then, hit hard and fast. While one kingdom was busy wondering if Qin was really coming for them, the next one was already halfway to surrender. It was part psychological warfare, part political manipulation, and part good old-fashioned sword swinging. Ministers worked the diplomatic angles, spies whispered into the right ears, and generals sharpened blades. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Break the enemy into bite-sized portions, and then feast. The other kingdoms might have called it ruthless, but Qin just called it lunch. The year was 230 BCE, and Qin's first target in the grand unification buffet was Han. Small, strategically placed, and about as threatening as a cat in a dog park. Han had been weakened by years of wars and was practically gift-wrapped for conquest. Yingzheng didn't waste time with long speeches or endless diplomacy. He sent his generals to knock on Han's door with the subtlety of a battering ram. The Qin army, fresh from years of reforms and weapon upgrades, marched in like a well-oiled war machine. Han's defenses, already paper-thin, crumbled faster than a stale rice cracker. Within months, the kingdom was swallowed whole, its lands absorbed into Qin's growing empire. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a statement. We're here, we're strong, and we've got room for more. And just like that, the dominoes of the warring states began to fall, one tidy topple at a time. Fresh off the victory over Han, Qin's eyes shifted toward Zhao, a state once feared for its military might, but now busy arguing with itself like a family at a reunion. The court of Zhao was a mess of rival factions, each convinced they were the smartest in the room, which made them easy pickings for Qin's divide and conquer strategy. Yingzheng didn't need to fight every soldier, he just had to fan the flames of their internal drama. Qin generals cleverly exploited the rivalries, bribing some officials, misleading others, and sending misinformation like it was the hottest gossip in town. Zhao's military, once disciplined, found itself crippled by poor coordination and mistrust. When Qin's armies finally advanced, it was less of a glorious clash and more of a staged demolition. Swift, methodical, and devastating. The people of Zhao barely had time to process the invasion before Qin banners were waving over their cities. It was a masterclass in using an enemy's chaos as your weapon. For years, the name Handan had been a bitter taste in Yingzheng's mouth. It was the city where he once lived as a hostage, enduring humiliation from the Zhao court. Now, with Zhao weakened and divided, the time for payback had arrived. The Qin army marched toward Handan like a tidal wave, not just to conquer, but to erase an old score from history's ledger. The battle was fierce at first, with Zhao's defenders clinging desperately to their walls. But Qin's siege engines, battering rams, and relentless archers made resistance look like a hopeless group project with no leader. Inside the city, panic spread faster than wildfire. Some nobles tried to flee, others switched sides before the gates even fell. When the walls finally cracked, Qin troops poured in with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Handan was taken, and Yingzheng walked its streets not as a humiliated boy, but as the man who had bent it to his will. Revenge, it turned out, looked a lot like victory, just louder and with more banners. After settling old scores with Zhao, Yingzheng set his sights on Wei, a kingdom that was basically the neighbor who always borrowed your tools and never returned them. Wei's capital, Dalian, was famous for its massive walls and elaborate moats, as if they designed the city with a do not disturb sign in mind. Qin's response? Challenge accepted. Instead of a direct assault, the Qin engineers decided to reroute the Yellow River to flood the city, because why climb walls when you can just sail over them? As the waters rose, Wei's defenses turned into very expensive swimming pools, and panic spread among the defenders. Some tried to escape by boat, others just climbed onto rooftops hoping for a miracle. No miracle came. By the time the flood subsided, Qin troops marched in, mopping up what was left, both militarily and literally. Dalian fell. Wei was swallowed into Qin's growing empire, and Yingzheng's campaign rolled on like a river that had just found a faster route. After swallowing Wei, Qin's appetite turned south toward Chu, an opponent so massive it made the others look like appetizer portions. Chu was rich, vast, and famous for warriors with an ego to match their swords. Qin's generals knew this wouldn't be a quick skirmish. It was going to be a buffet of chaos. The battle plans read like a cookbook for destruction. Lure Chu forces into open ground, slice through their flanks, and roast their morale over a steady fire of relentless assaults. Chu's armies were fierce, but Qin's discipline, superior steel weapons, and never-ending supply of war drums kept pressing forward. The clashes were brutal, muddy fields soaked with rain, and the occasional overconfident Chu commander charging straight into a trap. Weeks turned into months, and both sides traded victories like bad poker hands. But slowly, Chu began to crack. Villages fell, supply lines snapped, and the once proud southern giant started to stumble. This wasn't just a battle. It was the prelude to the fall of one of China's great powers. After months of grueling clashes, Qin finally landed the knockout punch on Chu. The once mighty southern powerhouse, with its sprawling lands and swaggering generals, was now a humbled shadow of itself. The decisive blow came when Qin's forces captured the Chu capital, sending their court into a frenzy that made a kick beehive look calm. The last Chu king, realizing the game was up, tried one final rally, but his troops were too battered, supplies too thin, and morale hanging by a thread. Qin's soldiers marched through the streets like they owned the place, because now they did. The victory was more than just another notch on Qin's belt. It was the end of a centuries-old rival that had loomed large over China's political chessboard. For Yingzheng, this wasn't just about territory. It was about removing a piece so big that the rest of the board suddenly looked much easier to win. With Chu gone, the path to unifying the empire was wide open, and Qin was already eyeing its next targets with a predator's grin. With Chu out of the way, Qin turned its gaze north toward Yan, a state known for its cold winters, cautious politics, and the occasional bold but questionable decision. Yan had once tried to assassinate Yingzheng, so you can imagine he wasn't exactly sending them holiday cards. Qin's armies advanced like a winter storm, swift and relentless. Yan's forces put up resistance, but their main army was crushed in a decisive battle that left their generals staring at the map like it had personally betrayed them. The campaign was surgical. Key cities fell one after another, cutting Yan's defenses apart like a master chef with a very sharp cleaver. Within months, the northern stronghold was in Qin's hands, its elite troops scattered or captured. Yingzheng saw this not only as revenge served cold, but also as securing the northern flank, ensuring no icy surprises would threaten his path to unification. The north was now quiet, and Qin's armies were already sharpening their swords for the final act. With Yan defeated, only Qi remained, a wealthy, cultured state that had managed to stay out of trouble by smiling politely and locking its doors. Qi's rulers, seeing Qin's unstoppable march, probably hoped that offering good wine and compliments might keep the wolves at bay. Spoiler, it didn't. Qin's armies advanced without much resistance. Qi's leaders had neglected to prepare their defenses, thinking diplomacy was enough. It was like bringing a tea set to a sword fight. When Qin troops crossed the border, most key officials surrendered faster than you could say unification. Cities opened their gates, markets continued buzzing, and it felt less like a conquest and more like a change in management. Within a short time, the Qin banner flew over Linzi, Qi's capital. The unification of China was now just a signature away, and Yingzheng could almost hear the drumroll of history as he prepared to crown himself the first emperor. Qi, once proud and independent, now became the final jewel in Qin's imperial crown. In 221 BCE, after years of relentless campaigning, Yingzheng of Qin stood atop history's grand stage. The 6 states were no more. Only one giant, unified China remained. This was no small family reunion. It was the first time the lands between the Yellow and Yangtze rivers were under a single ruler. Yingzheng wasn't content with just being called king, too basic. Instead, he crowned himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, because supreme overlord of everything probably didn't fit neatly on coins. His vision was grand: standardized laws, currency, weights, and even the width of cart axles, because traffic jams were timeless. He began massive construction projects, including roads that knitted the empire together and the early foundations of what would become the Great Wall. But behind the pomp, there was steel. Qin Shi Huang's rule was strict, centralizing power like never before. The age of warring states was over, replaced by the dawn of an empire that would echo through millennia. As fireworks existed only in the future, the celebration came in the form of triumphant drums, banners in the wind, and a very smug emperor in dragon robes. After unifying China, Yingzheng decided that the title king was far too plain for someone who had just ended centuries of chaos. Emperor sounded better, more cosmic, more dramatic, and frankly, more intimidating. So he invented a brand new title, Huangdi, meaning August Emperor, combining the grandeur of mythical rulers with the divine right of heaven itself. And because this was a fresh start for the whole empire, he made sure everyone understood that this wasn't a democracy, a republic, or even a polite monarchy. It was a full-on autocracy. The emperor's word was law, his will the empire's compass. Court officials bowed so low they practically dusted the floor with their foreheads, while messengers ran breathlessly to carry imperial decrees to the farthest corners of the land. It was the dawn of an era where one man sat at the top of the world's most elaborate game of political chess, with millions of subjects as the pieces. And if anyone thought of rebelling, the emperor's gaze and his army would be there before they could even finish whispering about it over tea. With his shiny new title as emperor secured, Qin Shi Huang turned to an even bigger project, turning China into one giant, centrally controlled machine. The first step? Smashing the old feudal system like a clay pot and replacing it with a network of commanderies and counties. No more semi-independent lords throwing fancy banquets while plotting rebellions on the side. Now governors and magistrates were appointed directly by the emperor, ensuring loyalty flowed only upward, straight to the throne. Local officials could be fired faster than you could say imperial decree, and taxes, laws, and orders suddenly had the same weight whether you lived in the capital or a remote mountain village. This wasn't just administration, it was political feng shui, rearranging power so every line pointed back to Qin Shi Huang. And while some former nobles sulked about losing their family fiefdoms, the emperor was too busy drawing perfect, straight borders on a massive map, probably with a ruler in one hand and a smug grin on his face. After redrawing China's political map, Qin Shi Huang turned his attention to something far sneakier than armies and taxes: the written word. Back then, every region had its own way of writing, and reading a contract from another province was like trying to read your doctor's handwriting. Technically the same language, but practically illegible. The emperor decided enough was enough. He ordered the creation of a standardized script so merchants, scholars, and tax collectors could all finally be on the same page, literally. This move wasn't just about literacy, it was about control. If everyone wrote the same way, it was much easier to spread imperial decrees without playing a deadly game of guess the hieroglyph. Overnight, scribes across the empire had to ditch their local flourishes and learn the imperial style. Some grumbled, others marveled, but all knew one thing. From now on, even your grocery list had to look appropriately Qin. After taming the wild world of scripts, Qin Shi Huang turned his gaze to another chaotic battlefield: money. Back then, every region had its own coins: round, square, knife-shaped, spade-shaped, you name it. Trying to trade across provinces was like attempting to pay your rent in seashells. The emperor decided enough was enough. He introduced the standardized Banliang coin, perfectly round on the outside, square hole in the middle. Why a square hole? To string them together, making it easier to carry large sums, and maybe to encourage people to feel the hole in their wallets. Merchants now didn't have to lug around mismatched currencies or argue about exchange rates. Of course, not everyone loved the new coins. Some missed their quirky local money. But Qin's coinage reform turned the empire into one giant, smooth-running cash machine. From bustling market stalls to distant border garrisons, everyone now jingled with the same metallic music. After unifying coins, Qin Shi Huang moved on to another headache: measurements. In the old days, one merchant's foot could be another merchant's half a foot, and a pound in the north could be a pound and a half in the south. Trading was basically a math puzzle where everyone cheated. The emperor decided it was time for one ruler, literally and figuratively. He issued standardized measuring tools for length, weight, and volume. From now on, a foot was a foot everywhere, and a pound wouldn't mysteriously gain weight when crossing provincial borders. This reform didn't just make trade smoother, it also made tax collection a whole lot more precise, which of course, the emperor loved. Farmers, merchants, and officials could finally agree on what they were measuring, though some grumbled that it took the fun out of haggling. Qin's empire was now marching to the beat of one measuring stick, and woe to anyone who tried to sneak in an extra scoop. Coins, unified. Measures, unified. But without rules, an empire is just a very expensive group chat. So Qin Shi Huang rolled up his sleeves and gave the realm what it needed most: one hard-edged, empire-wide legal code. Local customs that contradicted the center were politely shown the exit. From frontier forts to river markets, the same statutes, the same penalties, the same very official frowns. Officials received bamboo law tablets, slimmer than a sword, but twice as frightening. Ignorance was not a defense, and improvisation was definitely not encouraged. Households were registered, neighborhoods organized for mutual responsibility, and travel permits made wandering romantics suddenly very punctual. Inspectors, those legendary bringers of paperwork, appeared without warning, checking weights, tax rolls, and whether the magistrate was actually doing his job instead of doing poetry. Punishments scaled from fines and hard labor to truly reputation-destroying consequences. Bribery, favoritism, and I know a guy were treated like national hobbies to be eradicated. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was maintenance. Tightening bolts on a thunderous machine so it wouldn't shake itself apart. People grumbled, then complied, then quietly enjoyed safer roads and less swindling at the market. The message was carved across the empire. One law, one standard, one very watchful throne. Laws in place and coins jingling in unison. Qin Shi Huang asked the most practical question of empire. How do you get stuff, from orders to onions to everywhere fast? Answer: roads. Not the squiggly goat paths of yesteryear, but imperial highways, arrows straight enough to make a carpenter blush. Surveyors marched ahead with ropes and plumb lines. Engineers cut through hills, raised causeways over marshes, and laid gravel so carts wouldn't sink at the first drizzle. Milestones popped up like polite GPS, great Qin signposts, while relay stations offered fresh horses, hot tea, and hotter gossip. Thanks to the standardized axle width, you remember that, every cart fit neatly into the same ruts, turning roads into ancient rail tracks. Couriers flew, tax grain rolled, and armies glided with unnerving punctuality. Merchants cheered, bandits sulked, and local potholes lost their political power. The network stitched mountains to coasts and capitals to border forts, so an imperial decree could outrun a rumor, and a regiment could outrun both. After law made people behave, roads made them arrive. Roads were great, but empty highways are just very tidy lines on a map. Qin Shi Huang wanted traffic, grain carts, craft goods, the whole logistical parade. So he pressed the big green button on production. Farms first, irrigation canals were dredged and extended, dikes repaired, and fallow fields coaxed back to life. Iron plowshares and sturdy ox yokes rolled out of state workshops like hot buns. And anyone who actually farmed got tax breaks. Anyone who only farmed excuses got a visit from an inspector with a very sharp quill. Settlement programs nudged spare hands toward underused land, where milestones doubled as excellent scarecrows. Meanwhile, artisans were organized into tidy, humming workshops. Standard molds meant chisels, knives, and roof tiles snapped into place like imperial Lego, while lacquerers and silk weavers turned out luxury goods fast enough to keep nobles fashionable and treasuries happy. Quotas were firm but fair. Meet them and you earned rewards. Miss them and you earned a motivational lecture from someone wearing armor. With canals feeding fields and highways feeding markets, the empire began to thrum like a well-tuned zither. Grain piled up in granaries, tools in depots, and profits in the tax office. The message was simple: grow more, craft smarter, move faster. The dragon eats well when every claw pulls together. For Qin Shi Huang, the noble class was like a bunch of retired warlords who still thought they were the main characters. That wouldn't do in an empire with one star on the poster, him. So he devised a subtle plan: politely invite nobles to leave their ancestral lands and relocate to the capital, where they could enjoy the city's bustling life and be conveniently under constant watch. Their estates were redistributed to loyal officials or turned into state-controlled farmland, which had the added benefit of reducing the number of private armies and upping the number of imperial lunch invitations. The emperor showered the nobles with titles, fancy robes, and courtly banquets, but kept the real power firmly in his hands. In the capital, the nobles were too busy attending ceremonies, writing flattering poetry, or arguing about tea etiquette to plot rebellions. Meanwhile, their absence back home allowed Qin administrators to standardize laws and taxes without the local lord popping up to say, "Actually, that's not how we do it here." In short, Qin Shi Huang turned a potentially dangerous aristocracy into a very well-dressed audience for his one-man show. Less Game of Thrones, more Empire's Got Talent. By the end of his Grand Reform Marathon, Qin Shi Huang had turned China into the political equivalent of a finely tuned crossbow, centralized, precise, and entirely in his grip. Gone were the days of feudal lords bickering over borders or writing passive-aggressive letters about irrigation rights. Now laws, taxes, currency, and even road widths followed imperial standards. A message from the capital could reach the farthest provinces in record time, thanks to his shiny new road network, perfect for trade, or for sending armies to politely remind people who's boss. The emperor's grand vision was simple: one empire, one system, one leader, preferably immortal if his alchemists could ever get their act together. His court bustled with officials carrying standardized scrolls. Farmers plowed in neat measured rows, and merchants jingled coins identical from one end of the empire to the other. For Qin Shi Huang, it wasn't just about power, it was about legacy. He wasn't building a kingdom, he was forging a political machine that could, in theory, run forever. Of course, that's the theory. History, as it tends to, had other plans. But for now, the empire was humming like a well-oiled chariot. Fresh off centralizing his empire, Qin Shi Huang decided it was time for the ultimate home security upgrade. The Great Wall. Not just any wall, this one would snake across mountains, deserts, and everything in between, linking up old regional fortifications into a mega barrier against the pesky Xiongnu raids from the north. Of course, he didn't exactly ask for volunteers. Tens of thousands of soldiers, farmers, and even convicts were marched out to remote and brutal landscapes, armed with little more than shovels, baskets, and the vague promise of eternal glory. The wall wasn't just a defense line, it was a political statement in stone, shouting, "We're unified, we're strong, and no one's crashing this party." The project was so massive that it became part military strategy, part national workout program, and part architectural flex. Under a blazing sun or freezing wind, laborers stacked rammed earth and stone, their sweat and probably some curses cementing the empire's northern shield. For Qin Shi Huang, it wasn't just about protection, it was about engraving his rule into the landscape itself, visible from space, or at least from the nearest mountain ridge. If the Great Wall was Qin Shi Huang's grand idea, then the labor force was his not-so-secret weapon. And by weapon, we mean hundreds of thousands of human backs, shoulders, and very sore feet. Soldiers, peasants, prisoners, and anyone unlucky enough to be within earshot of an imperial summons found themselves drafted into a building marathon across mountains and deserts. It wasn't just hard work. It was back-breaking, blister-making, and sometimes life-ending. Food was basic if you were lucky, and the workdays? Let's just say the concept of overtime pay didn't exist. Only work until it's done, or you're done. While the wall rose higher, the toll in human lives became a silent ledger in the emperor's quest for immortality in stone. Some say the bones of laborers ended up inside the wall itself. Whether that's true or just an ancient horror story, it cemented the wall's reputation as both a marvel and a graveyard. Yet for Qin Shi Huang, this was the price of greatness. An empire defended by stone and built on the sweat, blood, and stubborn endurance of its people. If Qin Shi Huang's Great Wall was about defense, then the Yipang Palace was about flexing, imperial style. Picture this, a building so massive that ancient records claim it could host 10,000 guests for dinner without anyone having to share a rice bowl. This wasn't just a palace, it was a mega mansion on steroids, complete with grand halls, sprawling gardens, and a roof supposedly shimmering with tiles like golden dragon scales. The emperor wanted every brick to whisper, "I am the center of the universe." Of course, construction came with the same Qin flair for efficiency, meaning armies of workers sweating under the sun, while supervisors dreamed up more extravagant features. Legends say that if completed, it would have made other royal residences look like backyard sheds. But the palace became as much a symbol of ambition as it was of excess. Critics saw it as proof that the emperor's ego had grown taller than his walls, while loyalists called it the crown jewel of Qin grandeur. Either way, it was clear, this was less a home and more a stone and timber press release declaring, "Behold my glory." While Qin Shi Huang's palaces and walls got all the headlines, the Zhengguo Canal was the unsung hero of his empire. Less glamorous, but absolutely crucial. Imagine a 150-kilometer-long waterway carved through mountains and plains, designed not to impress foreign envoys, but to feed the empire's belly. Built under the direction of engineer Zheng Guo, who ironically started as a spy for a rival state, the canal transformed the arid lands of the Guangzhong Plain into a grain paradise. With irrigation flowing like liquid gold, farmers could grow more crops, feed more people, and conveniently support more soldiers for the emperor's endless ambitions. Of course, construction wasn't easy. Mudslides, flooding, and the occasional farmer yelling, "You just flooded my cabbages," were part of the process. But once completed, the Zhengguo Canal became a strategic lifeline, ensuring that the Qin army's rice bowls were always full. It might not have had dragon motifs or golden rooftops, but in the game of empire building, this was the quiet MVP, because you can't conquer the world on an empty stomach. If the Zhengguo Canal was the Qin Empire's secret weapon, the waterway connecting the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers was their fast travel cheat code. By linking these two mighty rivers, Qin Shi Huang essentially gave his army, merchants, and tax collectors a high-speed aquatic highway. No toll booths, no speed limits, but plenty of boat traffic jams. This engineering marvel allowed goods, soldiers, and orders to move quickly between the fertile south and the political heartland in the north. Farmers in the Yangtze region could send rice to the north, while northern iron and weapons could sail south. Of course, digging a river-long canal wasn't a picnic. Workers battled mud, mosquitoes, and the occasional curious water buffalo wandering into the construction site. Yet once finished, it was a logistical game-changer. Trade boomed, supply lines shortened, and Qin's control tightened. It wasn't as flashy as a palace or as imposing as the Great Wall, but in the empire's efficiency playbook, this waterway was pure genius, because an emperor who controls the flow of water controls the flow of power. If the Qin dynasty had a mic drop moment, it was probably the groundbreaking of Emperor Qin Shi Huang's tomb. Forget a modest resting place. This was going to be an underground metropolis, a royal Airbnb for eternity. Legend says it took 700,000 laborers to carve, brick, and decorate the colossal complex, complete with palaces, treasure vaults, and booby traps to discourage tomb raiders. The emperor wasn't planning for a quiet afterlife. He wanted a VIP lounge where, even in death, he'd still outshine the living. The project became an empire-wide obsession, swallowing resources, manpower, and probably every available bronze chisel in China. Workers dug deep into the earth, building chambers designed to mirror his capital above ground. The most jaw-dropping part? Streams of mercury to represent rivers and seas, shimmering under the flicker of oil lamps. Basically, the world's first deadly light show. Construction continued right up to the emperor's death, proving that when it came to legacy, Qin Shi Huang didn't think small. His tomb wasn't just a final home. It was a posthumous flex, a concrete, well, brick and earth statement that says, history will remember me, even if it has to dig a little. If the afterlife had a security system, Emperor Qin Shi Huang installed the deluxe package, the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-size clay soldiers, each with unique facial features, hairstyles, and armor, were crafted to stand guard over his eternal rest. We're talking full military formation, infantry, archers, cavalry, even chariots, all frozen mid-march as if ready to charge at the first sign of ghost trouble. The attention to detail was insane. Real bronze weapons, painted armor, and facial hairstyles that would make a hipster barber proud. These warriors weren't just decoration. They were a clay insurance policy, ensuring that the emperor could still flex his power in the hereafter. Artisans worked for years, producing not cookie-cutter copies but individualized soldiers, each one looking like he just got called for a portrait. It was both an artistic marvel and a not-so-subtle message to the spirits. Mess with me, and you'll deal with my army. Even 2,000 years later, when they were unearthed, the soldiers still looked like they were silently judging every archaeologist who dared disturb their watch. If Emperor Qin's tomb was his final palace, then it wasn't just a crypt. It was an underground replica of the Qin capital, Xianyang. Imagine a subterranean city built for one very dead but very important tenant. The layout was said to include grand halls, offices, stables, gardens, and even rivers of flowing mercury to mimic natural waterways. Apparently, ancient feng shui rules also applied 6 feet under. The scale was absurdly ambitious. Chambers lined with precious stones, ceilings painted to resemble the night sky, and walls decorated with scenes of imperial glory. It was basically Sim City Afterlife Edition. The design wasn't just for show. It reinforced the idea that Qin Shi Huang would rule in death as he did in life, complete with bureaucracy, guards, and probably a ghostly tax department. This underground metropolis was protected by the Terracotta Army, making it the most secure and least visited city in history. Archaeologists today have only explored the outskirts. The main chambers remain sealed, partly to preserve them, partly because, well, nobody wants to risk running into mercury rivers or waking up an emperor with trust issues. For all its fame, Qin Shi Huang's tomb is still mostly a mystery box, sealed tighter than an emperor's purse strings. Ancient texts hint at rivers of mercury, booby traps ready to skewer grave robbers, and treasures that would make even the greediest warlords sweat. Archaeologists have resisted opening the main chamber, partly because the technology to preserve its contents without damage isn't ready, and partly because no one wants to find out if the poison gas warnings from 2,000 years ago were just colorful metaphors. Theories run wild: hidden libraries, priceless jade artifacts, maybe even scrolls revealing state secrets like how to rule forever, but fail anyway. Some believe the inner sanctum might confirm or rewrite huge chunks of Chinese history, while others suspect it's exactly what the records say: a grand mausoleum for one man who refused to downsize in death. Until that day comes, the tomb remains the world's most epic do-not-open package, guarded by its silent terracotta sentinels and wrapped in a cloak of mystery that has lasted over 2 millennia. Looking back at Qin's monumental legacy, it's hard not to feel both awe and a tiny bit of concern, like admiring a friend's lavish mansion while wondering how many people fainted carrying the marble bathtub inside. From the Great Wall's endless spine to the opulent Afang Palace, from mighty canals to the underground wonderland of the first emperor's tomb, every project screamed power, ambition, and I have more workers than you. Yet behind the stone and glory were staggering costs: human lives, drained coffers, and a populace that sometimes felt they were building more for the emperor's ego than for their own good. These works cemented Qin Shi Huang's name in history, but they also sparked debates that echo even now. Can greatness be measured only by scale, or must it also serve the people? In the end, the Qin left behind structures so vast that centuries couldn't erase them, and questions so big that even time hasn't fully answered. Their legacy is equal parts jaw-dropping achievement and cautionary tale, a reminder that monuments can be both triumphs and warnings carved in stone. Before Qin Shi Huang started ruling like the ultimate boss of ancient China, he needed a manual, and no, it wasn't leadership for dummies. His playbook came from the sharp minds and sharper tongues of Shang Yang and Han Fei, the masterminds behind legalism. Forget the gentle guidance of Confucianism. Legalism was more like, break a rule and you'll regret it before lunch. It was all about strict laws, centralized power, and the idea that people behaved better when they were slightly terrified. Shang Yang championed reforms that turned the state into a well-oiled, no-nonsense machine, while Han Fei wrapped those ideas in political theory sharp enough to cut through a silk robe. Qin Shi Huang took this philosophy and ran with it, straight into a system where laws were clear, punishments were harsh, and nobody dared sneeze in the wrong direction without a permit. In his mind, order wasn't a happy accident. It was engineered, enforced, and, if necessary, hammered into place. And while it kept the empire in line, it also made sure that fun was not a recognized legal category. In Qin Shi Huang's empire, the law wasn't just strict. It was a terrifyingly sharp sword dangling over everyone's head. Forget about a slap on the wrist. Here, even a small mistake could land you in deep trouble. Steal a chicken? Lose your hand. Talk badly about the emperor? Lose your head. The laws were so detailed that you could practically get fined for sneezing too loudly in the wrong direction. Officials enforced them with the enthusiasm of over-caffeinated hall monitors. And punishments were public, because nothing teaches obedience like watching your neighbor get flogged for planting his crops 2 days late. For Qin Shi Huang, harsh laws weren't cruelty. They were a necessary kindness to keep chaos in check. But in reality, it made the empire feel like one giant do not touch sign. Sure, people behaved themselves, but they also walked around with the permanent expression of someone who just realized they left the stove on. It was order, yes, but the kind you get when everyone's too scared to breathe wrong. If Qin Shi Huang's laws were the teeth of his rule, then his spy network was the tongue. Always moving, always listening, and definitely not something you wanted to get caught by. The empire buzzed with whispers because anyone could be an informant. Your neighbor, your friend, maybe even your grandma if she caught you mumbling about taxes. Reports flowed like rivers into the capital, each one detailing who said what, when, and with which facial expression. A casual complaint about road construction might mysteriously turn into a full investigation. And the spies? Oh, they weren't James Bond types. More like nosy uncles with the observational skills of a hawk and the subtlety of a gong. Qin believed this omnipresent web of eyes and ears would crush rebellion before it even thought about existing. In reality, it made everyone act like they were in a never-ending theater performance, smiling too much, speaking too carefully, and glancing over their shoulder like paranoid squirrels. It was social surveillance, ancient China edition, minus the Wi-Fi, but with way more bamboo scrolls. When Qin Shi Huang decided he wanted total control of ideas, he didn't just ban a few troublesome books. He went full bonfire mode. Scholars who dared to talk about the good old days or Confucian ideals found themselves in the middle of a very permanent career change. Underground. His logic was simple. No books, no criticism, no critics, no problems. To him, history was like clay, something you could reshape as long as you burned the old molds. The imperial decree sent officials sweeping through towns, confiscating scrolls faster than a flash sale, stacking them into massive piles, and lighting them up like ancient rock concerts, minus the music, plus more screaming. And the scholars, those who refused to update their software to Qin's approved version, were given a one-way ticket to the afterlife. The result was an eerie intellectual silence, like someone had hit the mute button on an entire civilization. Qin thought this would make his rule eternal. What it really did was turn him into history's most infamous librarian, the kind who returned all the books to ash. After the grand bonfire and scholar relocation program, Qin Shi Huang wasn't done yet. He wanted a mental monopoly. Competing schools of thought? Deleted. Philosophers who still preach Confucian virtue or Taoist harmony? rebranded as unemployed troublemakers. He ordered officials to hunt down any surviving teachings not aligned with legalism, like a ruthless ancient editor cutting every scene that didn't match the emperor's script. The empire's intellectual menu was reduced to one dish, the law, served cold and without garnish. Public debates vanished faster than free wine at a wedding, and diversity of thought went extinct in official records. For Qin, this was efficiency. For everyone else, it was like living in a kingdom where the only song on the radio was the national anthem, on repeat, forever. By wiping out rival ideologies, he ensured there was only one voice left, his own. The empire might have been unified in thought, but it also became a very lonely place for ideas. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with control didn't stop at ideas. It extended to the people themselves. The empire became a giant game of where's everybody, thanks to the household registration system, or hukou. Every family had to register names, ages, and occupations, and moving without permission was basically a crime. Forget spontaneous road trips. In Qin times, you needed more paperwork than a modern-day passport office. Officials tracked who lived where, who worked what job, and possibly even who owned the fattest pig in the village. This wasn't just nosy bureaucracy. It allowed the state to manage taxes, labor drafts, and military conscription with terrifying precision. Guards at city gates doubled as human GPS systems, checking travelers' documents before letting them through. It created a population that was easier to control than a Terracotta Army, because at least the clay soldiers didn't try to sneak away. For the emperor, it was order. For the people, it was like living in a permanent game of hide and seek, except the seeker always had your address. In Qin Shi Huang's empire, weapons in private hands were about as welcome as a fox in a henhouse. The law was crystal clear. No swords, no spears, no pointy sticks that could poke a hole in imperial authority. Only the state army could carry weapons, and they flaunted them like runway models showing off the latest in bronze chic. Citizens were required to turn in any weapons they owned, often under the watchful eye of stern officials who looked like they'd confiscate your chopsticks if they seemed too sharp. Collected weapons were melted down, not for plows, but for giant statues glorifying the emperor, because nothing says peace like turning your sword into a 12-foot bronze qin. For the common folk, disputes were now settled with words, fists, or, in extreme cases, very aggressive broom handles. It was a move that reduced uprisings but also left the people defenseless against the most dangerous threat of all, rising taxes. Under Qin Shi Huang's rule, being a nosy neighbor wasn't just a pastime, it was state policy. The emperor actively encouraged people to report on each other, from suspicious behavior to whispering the wrong kind of poetry. Rewards were offered for informants, but here's the catch. If you didn't report a crime you knew about, you could be punished right along with the culprit. This collective punishment meant entire families or villages could suffer for one person's misstep. Imagine your cousin cheating on his grain tax, and suddenly your whole family is shoveling dirt for the Great Wall. The policy kept everyone on their toes, and occasionally on each other's throats, turning communities into a mix of tight-lipped silence and fake smiles. It worked brilliantly to suppress dissent, but it also bred paranoia so thick you could slice it with one of the confiscated swords from the previous law. Qin Shi Huang didn't just rely on strict laws to keep control. He wrapped them up in a shiny package of propaganda. The empire churned out grand public speeches, lavish parades, and murals showing the emperor as a benevolent father figure, who just happened to have the power to execute you for stepping out of line. Officials spread slogans about unity, strength, and loyalty, making sure the people heard them so often they could recite them in their sleep. Even coins and official seals carried the imperial message, turning everyday transactions into subtle brainwashing sessions. Public works weren't just practical, they were billboards for Qin greatness. The Great Wall? Not just defense, but a symbol that we are unbreakable. Canals? Proof that the emperor made the rivers obey. It was a mix of fear and flattery, discipline and decoration, like getting a beautifully wrapped gift, only to find out it's a legal code inside. In the short term, Qin Shi Huang's iron-fisted legalism was like a strong medicine. It worked fast, killing chaos and disorder almost overnight. Roads were safe, Taxes flowed in, and no one dared sneeze in public without permission. But beneath the surface, resentment brewed like tea left too long in the pot, bitter and ready to spill. People followed the rules, yes, but out of fear rather than love for the empire. Scholars whispered in secret, peasants grumbled while farming. And even officials kept one eye on their duty and the other on their own survival. The system's flaw was simple. Fear builds obedience, but it doesn't build loyalty. So while the empire shone like polished bronze on the outside, cracks were forming inside. And when Qin's unyielding grip loosened, all that bottled-up anger came rushing out. The legalist dream brought lightning-fast stability and planted the seeds of its own downfall. The Xiongnu in the north were the kind of neighbors you didn't invite for tea, because they'd arrive on horseback unannounced and leave with your tea set, your cattle, and probably your front gate. Qin Shi Huang had seen enough. Instead of sending endless armies to chase them across the steppes, he decided to build something so big, so intimidating, that even the Xiongnu's best horse would hesitate: the Great Wall. Of course, it wasn't called that yet. More like the really long, really hard-to-climb fence. Thousands of workers, soldiers, and convicts were mobilized, stacking stone and tamping earth from sunrise to sunset. The idea was simple. If you can't make your enemies your friends, at least make visiting you a serious cardio workout. And as the wall snaked across mountains and deserts, Qin sent a clear message to the north: "This is my lawn, stay off it." The wall didn't stop every raid, but it did slow them down and gave Qin a shiny new symbol of his empire's muscle. While the northern front meant walls and watchtowers, the southern front required something far trickier: conversation. The tribes in the lush, humid south weren't raiding on horseback. They were paddling up rivers with gifts, trade goods, and sometimes just to see what Qin was up to. Qin Shi Huang realized that keeping them friendly meant mixing diplomacy with a dash of intimidation. Envoys were sent carrying silk, bronze mirrors, and the emperor's best "smile but don't push your luck" expression. In return, the tribes offered exotic goods like fragrant spices, tropical hardwood, and fruits so strange that court officials debated whether to eat them or worship them. Of course, not every meeting was all handshakes and herbal tea. Sometimes tensions flared, and Qin's messengers had to remind their hosts that the empire's borders came with a large, heavily armed customer service department. Still, forging these ties kept the South relatively calm and gave Qin bragging rights as a ruler who could win hearts without always unsheathing a sword. After shaking hands with the southern tribes, Qin Shi Huang decided it was time to make the relationship more official by moving the border a few hundred miles south. The lush region of Lingnan promised fertile land, exotic resources, and just enough mystery to make court officials whisper about dragons in the mountains. But expanding here wasn't just a stroll with a map. It meant sending soldiers, surveyors, and a whole lot of paperwork. Qin generals led disciplined troops through dense forests and sweltering heat, building forts as they went, while local guides cheerfully pointed out which rivers were safe to cross and which ones had crocodiles with tourist-unfriendly attitudes. Villages were incorporated into the empire, often greeted with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, especially when Qin tax collectors showed up. Still, the expansion brought new trade routes, access to rare goods, and the satisfaction of coloring in more of the imperial map. For Qin Shi Huang, Lingnan wasn't just a new territory. It was proof that the empire's reach could stretch from icy northern winds to steamy southern jungles. Once Lingnan was officially part of the Qin Empire, the next step was filling it with people loyal to the emperor, or at least people who knew how to fill out tax forms. The government organized massive migration waves, sending farmers, craftsmen, and a fair share of grumbling merchants to settle in the new frontier. Convoys of ox carts rolled south, stacked high with tools, seeds, and occasionally a chicken that refused to stop squawking. The journey was an adventure in itself: muddy roads, unpredictable weather, and the occasional wild animal auditioning for the role of lunch thief. Upon arrival, settlers built houses, plowed fields, and tried to blend Qin discipline with local customs, sometimes ending up with hybrid dishes like spicy bamboo dumplings. The idea was simple: populate the land, secure it, and make it economically useful. For the emperor, every new household in Lingnan was like a nail pinning the map of the empire firmly in place. For the settlers, it was the start of a new life and a long-term relationship with mosquitoes. To truly secure the newly expanded borders, the Qin didn't just send settlers, they sent soldiers, lots of them. Strategic regions were turned into military zones, complete with watchtowers, barracks, and enough weapon storage to make any blacksmith rich. Garrisons popped up like bamboo shoots after rain, each filled with disciplined troops trained to respond faster than a rabbit spotting a hawk. The emperor's plan was simple. If trouble started brewing, there would already be a wall of spears waiting, but military presence wasn't just about fighting, it was about sending a message. This land belongs to Qin, and we have the swords to prove it. Soldiers also mingled with locals, sometimes awkwardly, creating a curious cultural exchange. You might see a Qin soldier learning how to dance to local music, or trying exotic spicy stew with the caution of someone defusing a bomb. By militarizing these key points, Qin turned its frontier into a heavily guarded chessboard, where every piece was ready to strike. Once the borders were secured, the Qin Empire looked beyond defense and saw an opportunity: trade. If soldiers kept the peace, merchants could bring the profits. Long caravans began winding their way across mountains and deserts, carrying silk, salt, tea, and more exotic treasures like spices and strange musical instruments. Trade routes became the empire's arteries, pumping wealth and foreign wonders straight into the heart of Qin. Of course, this wasn't just about money, it was also a subtle form of diplomacy. When you share goods, you share goodwill, and sometimes food poisoning from trying unfamiliar snacks. Local chiefs along these routes learned that it was better to welcome Qin traders with a smile than face their armies with a frown. The emperor understood that commerce could be as powerful as any spear. After all, it's hard to go to war with someone who's also your best supplier of luxury lacquerware and sweet-dried fruits. Sometimes swords and shields can't win hearts, but weddings can. The Qin court, always practical, saw marriage as a handy diplomatic tool. Why send an army to subdue a tribe when you can send a charming princess instead? So the emperor began arranging unions between Qin royalty or nobles and leaders of neighboring tribes. These alliances brought peace treaties wrapped in silk wedding gowns. Of course, such marriages weren't always fairy tales. Imagine a tribal chief trying to navigate court etiquette, or a Qin bride learning how to eat roasted yak without looking horrified. But these unions forged bonds stronger than treaties signed under duress. Alongside gifts of gold, livestock, and luxury goods came an unspoken agreement. We're family now, so let's not invade each other. It was politics in its most intimate form, sealed not by ink, but by wedding vows and awkward family dinners. When diplomacy failed and rebellion stirred, the Qin didn't send flowers, they sent soldiers. Newly annexed regions sometimes tested the emperor's patience, thinking distance meant defiance. Big mistake. Qin forces, drilled to perfection, would sweep in like a thunderstorm, quelling uprisings before they could grow teeth. It wasn't just brute force, it was a carefully choreographed display, armor gleaming, banners flying, drums pounding in perfect rhythm. Local leaders quickly realized resisting the Qin was like arguing with a wall that could march, shout, and stab. Punishments were harsh but calculated, sending a message: you can be part of the empire and prosper, or you can fight and regret it. Some rebellions fizzled out before the first spear was thrown, simply from hearing the army was on its way. Qin rule was tough love in its most intimidating form. Less, come join us, and more, you've already joined, so behave. For the Qin Empire, a border without a garrison was like a teapot without a lid. Something bad was bound to spill in. So the solution? Dot the frontier with military outposts, each a miniature fortress buzzing with soldiers who doubled as guards, scouts, and part-time construction workers. These forts weren't just for show, they kept an ever-watchful eye on trouble brewing beyond the horizon. Messengers dashed in and out with news of bandits, wandering tribes, or suspiciously large herds of livestock near the border. Inside, life for the troops was a mix of grueling drills, repairing walls, and complaining about the food. but they knew their presence was the difference between a safe empire and a surprise invasion. If anyone tried sneaking in, they'd be met with a wall of shields and a look that said, "We have orders and you're not on the guest list." In short, the Qin's border posts turned the edge of the empire into a line that nobody wanted to cross uninvited. After years of hammering nails, drawing borders, and politely, or not so politely, telling neighbors to keep off the lawn, the Qin Empire finally stood with borders wide and secure. From the towering fortresses in the north to the bustling trade routes in the south, the empire's edges no longer felt like fragile lines on a map, but like sturdy walls in a house built to last. The Great Wall kept northern raiders guessing, southern diplomacy kept trade flowing, and military garrisons ensured that any trouble was handled before it became a headline. Qin officials could finally sip tea without glancing nervously toward the horizon, though some still did, just out of habit. Farmers settled in new lands, merchants carried exotic goods across safer roads, and the empire's might echoed in every market, fortress, and banquet hall. The message was clear. This was not a patchwork of territories anymore, but one strong, stitched-together quilt. And if anyone thought about testing it, well, let's just say that Qin had a long list of ways to remind them why that was a bad idea. For all his iron-fisted control and monumental achievements, Emperor Qin Shi Huang had one tiny, nagging problem: mortality. The man who could order mountains to be moved and rivers to be redirected still couldn't boss death around. And that drove him absolutely nuts. His paranoia was legendary. Every cough in the palace was suspect, every shadow in the hallway a potential assassin, or worse, the Grim Reaper himself. He saw life as a chess game where he'd already conquered every piece on the board, except that smug little king named Death, who refused to surrender. Courtiers whispered that the emperor's obsession kept him up at night, pacing the palace in silk robes, imagining ways to outwit the inevitable. In his mind, immortality wasn't just a luxury, it was the final, ultimate conquest. And if ruling an empire was like owning the biggest mansion in the world, then death was the rude landlord knocking at the door. Qin Shi Huang decided he would find the key to lock that door forever, no matter the cost, or how ridiculous the plan might sound. Faced with the ticking clock of mortality, Emperor Qin Shi Huang decided it was time to outsource the problem. Enter Xu Fu, the most famous project manager for immortality in Chinese history. The emperor summoned him and gave a mission brief that was part treasure hunt, part fantasy novel. Find the mythical elixir of life said to exist on the mystical island of Penglai. The stakes, eternal life for the emperor, and possibly the heads of anyone who failed. Xu Fu, perhaps sensing that saying no wasn't an option, bowed deeply and accepted. The emperor described Penglai as a paradise where immortal beings lounged in palaces of jade, sipping dew and laughing at mortals. Of course, no one had actually seen it, but why let details ruin the dream? With imperial funding and zero budget constraints, Xu Fu assembled ships, crews, and enough supplies to stock a floating city. As he departed, the emperor watched from the shore, imagining his future as an eternal ruler, sipping tea while centuries passed like seasons. In his mind, this wasn't just a mission, it was destiny in the making. Xu Fu's expedition was no small fishing trip. It was a full-blown maritime adventure, worthy of an epic saga. With dozens of ships, hundreds of sailors, and more crates of supplies than a modern cruise ship buffet, the fleet sailed off into the unknown. The mission? Find the elixir of life, preferably without running into sea monsters or pirates. Each morning, the crew scanned the horizon for Penglai, expecting to see floating palaces or dragons pulling chariots. Instead, they mostly saw more water. Still, Xu Fu kept morale high by telling grand tales of the treasures and immortals that surely awaited them. Right after the next wave, storms tested their courage, strange islands teased their hopes, and exotic fruits provided some consolation, though none made anyone immortal. Back in the capital, Qin Shi Huang awaited news like a child waiting for a festival gift, imagining each day that a messenger would burst in with a glittering vial of eternal youth. The truth, however, was that the journey was becoming more about survival than about sipping dew in the land of immortals. For Qin Shi Huang, palaces were like snacks. You couldn't have just one. No sooner was a grand hall finished than he was already sketching the next, each one bigger, shinier, and more elaborate than the last. Ministers groaned, architects wept, and laborers developed muscles worthy of heroic statues. Every palace had to outshine the previous, marble floors polished to mirror perfection, gilded pillars reaching for the heavens, and gardens so extravagant they could feed a small village. Courtiers learned to navigate the ever-changing palace map like explorers in a labyrinth, often getting lost on the way to an audience. To the emperor, these projects were not just displays of wealth, they were monuments to his eternal reign, physical proof that his power would never fade. While commoners marveled at the glittering skyline of the capital, they also muttered about taxes so high they could buy the moon. Still, Qin Shi Huang's obsession continued, as if each new palace brought him one step closer to immortality, or at least to being remembered as the man who turned the empire into a luxury real estate empire. Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality wasn't limited to ships and palaces. He dove headfirst into the world of mysterious arcane arts. If someone claimed they could brew a potion from moonlight, he'd demand a sample by sunrise. He summoned alchemists who promised elixirs of life, magicians who spoke in riddles, and mystics who swore they could whisper to the gods. The palace soon became a bizarre laboratory, filled with bubbling cauldrons, burning incense, and chanting at all hours. Some experiments produced nothing but foul smells. Others exploded in small but dramatic bursts of smoke, sending attendants running for cover. To Qin, these weren't failures, just steps toward unlocking the universe's deepest secrets. He believed that somewhere between swallowing mercury pills and mapping the stars lay the key to eternal life. Meanwhile, the imperial treasury shrank faster than a silk robe in hot water, but the emperor's curiosity remained insatiable. Each new ritual, each strange charm, was another gamble in his ultimate bet to outsmart death itself. If Qin Shi Huang was the CEO of immortality, then Taoist priests and alchemists were his senior management team. He didn't just meet them, he rolled out the imperial red carpet, complete with gold-threaded cushions and endless tea refills. These mystics arrived with long beards, whether real or glued on for extra credibility, flowing robes and scrolls packed with cryptic symbols that looked suspiciously like doodles. Some promised to summon heavenly blessings. Others bragged about their direct hotline to the afterlife. Qin listened intently, nodding as if each vague prophecy was the most profound thing he'd ever heard. Soon, the court was buzzing with debates about which constellation was hiding the secret to eternal life, or whether the elixir should be brewed under a blood moon or a solar eclipse. To Qin, these men were not just advisors. They were fellow conspirators in his grand plan to cheat death. The empire's affairs could wait. Immortality brainstorming sessions took priority. After all, what's the point of ruling forever if you don't have some eccentric geniuses to keep you entertained along the way? If money could buy immortality, Qin Shi Huang's treasury would have been the first to get a loyalty card. The emperor poured mountains of gold, silver, jade, and labor into his endless projects. Palaces that made Versailles look like a garden shed, expeditions to hunt down mythical herbs, and giant statues that served absolutely no purpose except to say, "I'm richer than the gods." The accounts must have given his treasurers daily panic attacks. "Your Majesty, we can either pay the army or fund this new gold-plated dragon boat." Naturally, the dragon boat won. Craftsmen worked around the clock, building opulence that no one would live in and ships that might never sail. Some ministers whispered that the emperor was spending the empire's fortune faster than a gambler in a silk robe at the imperial casino. But no one dared to say it out loud, unless they wanted a one-way ticket to the afterlife he was so desperately trying to avoid. For Qin, every coin was an investment in eternity, even if it left the living a little broke. In the imperial court, rumors were like imperial wine, passed around freely, potent, and sometimes deadly. Qin Shi Huang, however, drank them by the gallon. One whisper about a magical spring in the mountains. Dispatch 1,000 soldiers. A traveling merchant swears he saw an immortal sipping tea by the sea. Send a fleet. The emperor acted on gossip the way modern people click on miracle cure ads, fast and without checking the fine print. Ministers tried to verify facts, but by the time they returned, the emperor had already commissioned a grand expedition, complete with gold-plated compasses and silk sails. Sometimes these decisions led to bizarre outcomes. A lavish palace built in the middle of nowhere because someone swore it was where the gods vacationed, or thousands of workers digging for an immortal mushroom that turned out to be an oddly shaped rock. To Qin, it didn't matter if the stories were true. The mere possibility was enough to spend fortunes chasing them. After all, when your goal is eternal life, even the wildest rumor sounds worth the gamble. At first, the people of Qin were dazzled. Grand palaces, massive ships, and mysterious expeditions made for great gossip in the marketplace. But as the years rolled on, the shine wore off faster than gold paint in the rain. Taxes soared to fund the emperor's endless quests. Laborers were pulled from farms to build yet another palace no one would live in, and fishermen were forced to join ships chasing rumors instead of catching dinner. Grumbling turned into open complaints, and complaints turned into quiet rebellion in the back alleys. Some citizens mocked the emperor's projects in clever poems, while others cursed under their breath every time a new decree arrived. Even loyal soldiers began to question why they were guarding warehouses full of strange rocks labeled immortal mushrooms. The emperor, wrapped in his golden cocoon of ambition, barely noticed the growing unrest. But the tension was as thick as kanji left overnight, and everyone knew, except perhaps the emperor, that something was bound to boil over. And so, the emperor's quest for immortality had become a paradox, proof of his absolute power and a flashing neon sign of the tragedy ahead. Qin Shi Huang stood atop his empire, surrounded by palaces, alchemists, and fleets chasing clouds. Yet he remained haunted by the one enemy he could not conquer: time. His subjects whispered, his ministers sighed, and even his own body began sending subtle reminders that no amount of gold or mystical elixirs could buy forever. But the emperor pressed on, convinced that the next ship, the next potion, or the next grand construction would unlock eternity. History, however, had other plans. For all his victories, his grandest project would be a tomb so elaborate that it rivaled his own ambition. A silent city of clay soldiers guarding him for the afterlife he refused to admit was coming. In chasing life without end, he had unwittingly built his most enduring monument, the story of a ruler who tried to cheat death, and in doing so, became immortal in a way he never expected. In his final years, Qin Shi Huang turned his empire into his personal road trip map. Forget postcards. He collected mountain peaks and river crossings like a kid hoarding trading cards. His imperial tours stretched for months, with an entourage so large it could pass for a migrating city. Everywhere he went, roads were cleared, towns decorated, and unlucky officials braced for spontaneous inspections that could end in either a royal compliment or sudden unemployment, or worse. These journeys were part sightseeing, part political theater, and part mobile command center. The emperor wanted to show the people their ruler was still vigorous, still in control, and still capable of crossing deserts and climbing hills like a man half his age, even if the court doctors quietly stocked extra medicine in the luggage. But beneath the grandeur, there was also restlessness. Each tour was an excuse to search for mystical sites, hidden sages, and of course, any lead on the elusive elixir of life. The empire might have been settled, but Qin Shi Huang? He was still on the move, chasing both glory and immortality along every dusty road. Even after decades on the throne, Qin Shi Huang's obsession with immortality burned brighter than the imperial seal. Every stop on his grand tours doubled as a scouting mission for leads on the fabled elixir of life. No village was too remote, no rumor too absurd. If someone claimed an old hermit once brewed a potion from moonlight and pine needles, the emperor's men were already halfway there with a gold-laden gift basket. Taoist alchemists, traveling mystics, and snake oil salesmen lined up like it was an open casting call for the emperor's next miracle worker. Each offered elaborate scrolls, exotic powders, and complicated rituals that always seemed to require more rare ingredients and more funding. Qin Shi Huang wasn't naive. He suspected some were frauds. But what if one wasn't? Better to try them all than miss the one that worked. So the imperial caravan kept rolling, its cargo shifting from weapons and tribute to jars of suspicious tonics, strange herbs and seashells said to hum under the full moon. For the emperor, death wasn't inevitable. It was simply a problem waiting for the right invoice. For all his talk of immortality, Qin Shi Huang's body started filing complaints he couldn't ignore. The emperor, once a whirlwind of inspections, decrees, and ambitious projects, began to slow down. Fevers came and went like uninvited guests, and his once imposing voice now cracked mid-command. Court physicians hovered nervously, prescribing everything from heated wine infused with rare herbs to massages with jade rollers the size of rolling pins. The emperor took them all. After all, what if the cure was hiding in the next bizarre remedy? Yet the more he chased vitality, the more exhaustion clung to him. Whispers in the court grew louder. Perhaps the divine Son of Heaven was human after all. Still, Qin Shi Huang refused to rest, convinced that stopping would give death the advantage. So he pressed on with his tours, coughing into silk sleeves, glaring at any official who dared suggest slowing down. In his mind, illness was just another rebellion, one that could be crushed with sheer willpower and a large enough shipment of exotic medicine. While Qin Shi Huang was busy wrestling with fevers and swallowing enough exotic medicine to make an apothecary rich, the real game was happening in the shadows. Zhao Gao, the sly-eyed eunuch with a talent for manipulation, and Li Si, the sharp-tongued chancellor, were quietly plotting the future. To them, the emperor's declining health was less a tragedy and more an opportunity. Over late-night strategy talks disguised as urgent state matters, they mapped out who should inherit the throne. And spoiler alert, it wasn't the obvious choice. Whispered conversations turned into coded orders, and loyal officials who asked too many questions suddenly found themselves reassigned to important posts far away. Every cough from the emperor was music to their ears, every delay in court an opening for them to tighten their grip. By the time the imperial entourage set out on another tour, Zhao Gao and Li Si weren't just waiting for the emperor's final breath. They were choreographing the exact moment the political stage lights would shift in their favor. In 210 BCE, on yet another grand imperial tour, Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality hit the ultimate plot twist: mortality itself. Somewhere in the dusty outpost of Shakyu, the first emperor, who had survived assassination attempts, rebellions, and a diet of dubious alchemical pills, finally met the one enemy he couldn't conquer. Accounts vary, but many whisper about mercury-laced elixirs doing him in faster than any rebel army. The imperial entourage was stunned. After all, this was the man who had just been scolding ministers 2 days earlier for not finding the elixir of life. One moment he was dictating decrees, the next he was slumped over, the decree half-written. The scene was so abrupt, it was as if history itself had skipped a page. For all his power, walls, and soldiers, death strolled in without an appointment and claimed the most powerful man in the world, proving that even emperors can't negotiate with the Grim Reaper. With the emperor's body lying lifeless in Shakyu, the court faced a dilemma: announce his death and risk plunging the empire into chaos, or keep it quiet and pretend he was still breathing? Guess which option they picked. Under the crafty guidance of Zhao Gao, the imperial entourage decided to turn this into the most awkward road trip in history. Orders were given to seal the news, replace royal decrees with ones supposedly from the emperor, and keep up appearances as if His Majesty was just really tired. To mask the smell of decay in the hot summer, carts of rotting fish were ordered to travel with the convoy, because apparently the stench of fish was better PR than the truth. Guards marched in full ceremonial order, officials bowed to an empty palanquin, and commoners along the route whispered that the emperor had never looked so still. It was theater on wheels, and the audience had no idea the lead actor had already exited the stage. With the emperor's death still a top-secret state surprise, Zhao Gao knew it was time to play his biggest card, his pick for the throne. Hu Hai, the youngest and least prepared son, basically the imperial equivalent of handing the empire's keys to someone who'd never driven a chariot. The plan was simple: keep Hu Hai as a puppet, while Zhao Gao and his allies pulled every string. In a rushed coronation that felt more like a last-minute birthday party, ministers read out forged decrees from the late emperor endorsing Hu Hai. The young prince, wide-eyed and clearly overwhelmed, nodded along as if agreeing to rules of a game he didn't understand. Courtiers clapped politely, but their sideways glances screamed, "This is going to end badly." In the shadows, Zhao Gao's satisfied smirk said it all. He wasn't just appointing a ruler, he was setting the stage for his own rule. The empire had a new emperor, but the real power now wore a cunning grin and stood just behind the throne. Barely had the dust settled from Hu Hai's coronation when cracks began to appear. Big, obvious cracks you could ride a war chariot through. Zhao Gao's grip on the young emperor meant that decisions were less about ruling wisely and more about feeding his own ego. Taxes went up, punishments grew harsher, and anyone who dared complain found themselves mysteriously missing, probably promoted to digging in some remote quarry. Meanwhile, local governors and generals began thinking, why follow orders from a boy and his pet minister? Small uprisings popped up like weeds after the rain, each one testing the empire's fraying nerves. Whispers of rebellion spread through markets, taverns, and even palace kitchens. Farmers sharpened tools with a little too much enthusiasm. Merchants hid goods from tax collectors, and soldiers questioned why they were still loyal. It wasn't yet a full-blown civil war, but the scent of chaos was in the air, faint, bitter, and growing stronger by the day. Under the dim light of 1,000 oil lamps, the colossal tomb of Qin Shi Huang finally received its master. The procession was nothing short of dramatic. Guards in shining armor marched in slow, heavy steps. Musicians played somber tunes that sounded like they were auditioning for the saddest song in history, and the coffin itself, massive and ornate, was carried like the world's most dangerous VIP package. Legend had it that rivers of mercury flowed inside, and an army of terracotta warriors stood ready to protect the emperor in the afterlife, because apparently, even in death, he was not taking chances. As the stone gates closed, sealing him away for eternity, the crowd outside whispered half in awe, half in gossip. Is it true there's a miniature palace in there? I heard they buried live servants. Whether truth or myth, one thing was certain. Qin Shi Huang's final resting place wasn't just a tomb. It was a grand statement that screamed, I was here, I ruled, and I'm still kind of in charge. With the emperor now sealed in his grand tomb, the empire should have enjoyed a moment of peace. But instead, it was like taking the lid off a boiling pot. Court officials were whispering in corners, provinces were eyeing each other suspiciously, and the military was starting to wonder who was really in charge. Trio Cao and his puppet emperor, Hu Hai, were busy rearranging power as if playing a particularly cutthroat game of Go, except the stakes were an entire empire. Peasants grumbled about heavy taxes, generals plotted their own moves, and rumors spread faster than wildfire in a bamboo forest. Some said the mandate of heaven had left the Qin. Others claimed the late emperor's ghost still roamed the corridors, muttering about ungrateful successors. Either way, what followed was chaos in slow motion. A tumble from absolute power into a blender of rebellion, backstabbing, and collapsing authority. The great Qin dynasty, forged with iron will and ruthless efficiency, was about to find out how quickly an empire can go from unbreakable to oops. If there's one face that could make the entire Warring States period flinch, it's Qin Shi Huang's. The man was basically the human embodiment of the One China policy, except with more armor and less diplomacy. He welded a patchwork of feuding kingdoms into a single empire, and he didn't ask nicely. He told them, congratulations, you're unified. Resistance is futile. His reign was like a crash course in how to centralize power, standardizing weights, measures, currency, and even axle widths so carts could roll smoothly across the empire. Sure, his methods were about as gentle as a hammer to the forehead, but the results stuck, at least for a while. Under his rule, China stopped being a neighborhood of noisy tenants and became a fortress with one very stern landlord. Love him or loathe him, Qin Shi Huang's image became shorthand for unstoppable authority. The guy who took chaos by the neck and said, "Not on my watch." If Qin Shi Huang's unification was the flashy opening act, his administrative and legal system was the solid encore that kept the empire running. Well, for about 15 years, but hey, it left a mark. Imagine a bureaucracy so strict it made modern tax offices look like beach resorts. He divided the empire into commanderies and counties, each with officials who were more loyal to the emperor than to their own families. Laws. Oh, they were carved in stone, literally, and applied to everyone, from peasants to princes, with the same unflinching severity. The legal code was like a giant imperial rulebook with zero room for creative interpretation. Standardized measurements, written records, and a network of spies kept things efficient, or at least tightly controlled. While the system was a bit iron fist meets clipboard, it laid the groundwork for centralized governance in China for centuries. It's proof that sometimes legacy isn't about how long you last, but how deep your rules dig in. If Qin Shi Huang's laws were the bones of his empire, his monumental projects were the muscles flexing for the world to see. The Great Wall? Think of it as the ultimate do not disturb sign, only it stretched for thousands of miles, and the neighbors still tried to knock. Then there was his mausoleum, a sprawling underground city guarded by an army of life-size terracotta soldiers who looked ready to leap into battle, or maybe just complain about the lack of sunlight. These projects weren't just about defense or burial, they were statements. The Great Wall screamed, "We are strong, stay out," while the tomb whispered in a very loud whisper, "Even in death I rule." Sure, the cost was astronomical and the labor force included countless unfortunate conscripts, but Qin's mega construction secured him a VIP seat in history. Whether you admire the vision or question the ego, these creations still stand as some of humanity's boldest architectural mic drops. Even after the Qin dynasty clocked out for good, its fingerprints were all over Chinese culture. Like a boss who left, but still insists their vision is followed. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with unity didn't just stop at politics, it became a cultural default setting. The standardized writing system? It meant poets from distant provinces could actually understand each other's insults. The uniform legal codes and measurement systems? They turned chaotic trade into a well-oiled machine. Okay, maybe a well-oiled crossbow. Even the idea of centralized power kept echoing through dynasties like a catchy pop song that rulers couldn't stop remixing. From architecture inspired by his grand designs to a national identity that remembered we are one, Qin's cultural ripple effects were less of a ripple and more of a tidal wave. Sure, later dynasties added their own twists, but the stage Qin built stayed up for over 2,000 years. His rule may have ended abruptly, but his cultural aftertaste is still strong, like garlic in your noodles. The Qin dynasty's collapse was like watching a flashy fireworks show that fizzled out halfway. Impressive start, abrupt ending, and a lot of smoke left behind. Qin Shi Huang's iron grip had welded the empire together, but it also squeezed the life out of it. Harsh laws, endless labor projects, and zero room for dissent meant that when he died, the empire snapped back like an overstretched bowstring. The people, tired of hauling bricks for walls and digging tombs big enough to host a rock concert, weren't exactly loyal to the new emperor. Rebellions popped up faster than bamboo after rain, and in just a few years, the mighty Qin was history. The lesson? You can unite a country with fear, but you can't make it stay united without a little goodwill, and maybe fewer forced construction shifts. Ruling with an iron fist might be effective short-term, but it's not great for long-term customer satisfaction. When it comes to Qin Shi Huang, history can't seem to decide whether to hang his portrait in the Hall of Heroes or the Hall of Villains. On one hand, he's the guy who welded a dozen warring states into a single empire, standardized everything from coins to cart axle widths, and kicked off mega projects like the Great Wall. On the other hand, he also burned books, buried scholars, taxed like there was no tomorrow, and made forced labor a national pastime. Some hail him as a visionary leader who laid the foundation for China's unity. Others call him a ruthless autocrat who ruled with fear and suspicion. It's like reviewing a movie that's half masterpiece, half horror show. critics just can't agree. Maybe the truth is that he was both, a genius with a dash of paranoia, a builder with a sledgehammer, a man who left a legacy so big, even his enemies couldn't ignore it. Qin Shi Huang may have been gone for over 2 millennia, but in pop culture, he's basically still taking victory laps. From epic historical dramas where he strides in slow motion with windblown robes to fantasy films that make him the ultimate undead villain, the man gets more screen time than some modern celebrities. Video games cast him as a cunning strategist or an overpowered boss fight you regret triggering. Comic books? They turn him into a time-traveling emperor with laser eyes. Because why not? And then there are the memes. You haven't lived until you've seen a photoshopped Qin Shi Huang building the Great Wall with a power drill. Love him or loathe him, the first emperor has that rare icon status. Part fact, part legend, and part pop art caricature. In a way, he's proof that once you make history big enough, you'll never really leave the stage. You'll just get a new costume every few decades. Modern archaeology has turned Qin Shi Huang's era into the ultimate treasure hunt, minus the pirates, but with way more shovels and clipboards. From the moment farmers stumbled upon those first terracotta warriors in 1974, researchers have been like kids in the world's biggest sandbox, unearthing everything from intricately painted statues to bronze chariots with working parts. Advanced tech like ground-penetrating radar teases us with glimpses of what lies inside the still-sealed emperor's tomb. Supposedly rivers of mercury and ceilings studded with gems, basically an ancient VIP lounge. But opening it risks destroying priceless artifacts. So for now, it's the archaeological equivalent of a Netflix series stuck on Coming Soon. The finds so far have revealed not just Qin's obsession with power, but also the insane level of craftsmanship and logistical genius of his empire. Every dig is like a time machine, pulling back the curtain on a world that somehow feels both alien and familiar. If Qin Shi Huang's reign were a crash course in nation management, the syllabus would include how to centralize power in record time, infrastructure projects to impress both friends and foes, and, unfortunately, how to burn out an empire in 15 years or less. His unification of weights, measures, currency, and even axle widths was like turning an entire country into one perfectly matched Lego set. Smooth connections everywhere. The legal system, though strict to the point of terrifying, created order that lasted far beyond the Qin dynasty itself. Yet the rapid collapse of his empire is the ultimate cautionary tale. Without balancing power with flexibility, even the strongest structures can crumble faster than a sandcastle at high tide. For modern leaders, the takeaway is clear. Build big, think long-term, but maybe keep your people slightly less terrified so they don't revolt the second you're gone. And so our journey through the Qin dynasty wraps up, not with the sound of chariots or the clang of swords, but with a wink from history itself. Qin Shi Huang's legacy didn't just vanish with the fall of his empire. It seeped into the bedrock of China's governance, culture, and identity. From the standardized scripts still influencing Chinese writing to the legal and administrative structures echoed in later dynasties, his fingerprints are everywhere, like a ruler who insisted on signing every single page of history. Sure, his reign was short, intense, and occasionally terrifying, but its impact has lasted for over 2 millennia. The lesson? Bold visions can outlive even the most fleeting empires. Whether you see him as a visionary hero or an overzealous control freak, one thing's for sure. Qin Shi Huang's story is a reminder that the line between building an eternal legacy and becoming a cautionary tale is razor thin, and sometimes it's paved in stone.